When is the last time you listened to a podcast about web development, web design, and small business and didn't fall asleep? Yes, we cover web development, web design, and small business, but like actual human beings with personalities. If you're a beginner, we're not going to talk over your head. It's more like asking your buddy for help. We have guests, we have fun, and let me tell you, these two can get off on a tangent. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to HTML All the Things Podcast. This is Matt Lawrence and Mike Curran.
That's right, everybody. We are back. This is the HTML All the Things Podcast. This episode is titled JavaScript Tech We Loved But Don't Use As Much Anymore. So we are going to, of course, be talking about some technology that has kind of disappeared-ish. Now, I want to say ish is because some people definitely religiously use this stuff. This is not a reflection of, usage numbers from an actual survey or something. This is more sort of zeitgeist stuff, where it's sort of like, something like jQuery is probably a primo example and is something we're going to talk about. It's something where everyone used to talk about it. Everyone used to use it. And a lot of people still do. A lot of frameworks and tools, and the list goes on. I think WordPress still does things like that. jQuery is still used. This thing is not dead. However, it's not in the zeitgeist anymore. It's not the new exciting, kid on the block or whatever. New exciting kid on the block? Is that like a thing we do? Is that like what the...
Yeah, the other part of that, just a disclaimer further, is that this is like very specifically titled JavaScript tech that we loved and don't use much anymore. So it's like, we don't use it much. And again, like you said, that doesn't mean that everyone doesn't use it much.
Well, I was more so questioning my wording of new exciting kid on the block. Like I immediately imagined what's that movie with the clown? I immediately imagined it, where it's like the new kid's here, whatever, blah blah blah. But because the new kid's here is here, don't know why my brain went there.
I don't like that.
Just word soup. Anyway, word soup, but that's exactly what I thought of. Anyway, weird stuff. If this sounds interesting to you, because it's weird and interesting, you want to support the show, you can go check us out on that Patreon, leave a review, rating on your podcast app, join us in our Discord server, share this with your friends. I'd also like to just point out that we have a Scrimba discount once again. I will include the link in the show description, or sorry, not in the show description. I'll include it in the show notes at htmlallthethings.com. Go check that out. It is for 20%, I believe. The details will be in the actual show notes, so please go and check that out. So, Mike, you wrote up this episode for us. Why don't you take it away?
Yeah, and another disclaimer before, I am still currently a little bit sick. I have a little bit of a lower voice, and I won't be able to shout as much. Not that I shout very often, so sorry in advance if my voice is a little bit low, or if I, disappear and cough for a second. Feeling better, but weekend was a little bit rough. Getting out of it now, though, so no big deal. But another thing, like for this episode, to dive right in, the reason that I kind of thought of this is that I've used a lot of different technology as a web developer over the last 10 years. And for whatever reason, I sometimes have this nostalgic kind of like rose-colored glasses to a lot of it. And some of it I think is warranted, some of it isn't. And I really spent some time going through the technology that I've used that I'm not currently using in this episode, and pick the ones that I do still have correct, I think I do still have correct opinions of. Like, this was an awesome piece of tech back in the day. I used it for a good reason and it served me well, but it no longer is as relevant as it is today, right? So that's the kind of tech we're going to be covering. Most of the stuff I'm still pretty fond of in terms of like where it is or where it was, especially. This isn't like anything to do with like, this is bad tech or anything like that. That's one thing that I want to say. But we know that JavaScript evolves extremely quickly, right? Like, it's not something that stays stagnant very long. If you've ever tried to learn JavaScript from scratch, you know that you go to different documentations and it points you in 15 different directions. Well, that's because every day there's a new direction in JavaScript that changes the way that we do certain things. And because of that, technology will continue to evolve pretty quickly. I don't see that stopping too much anytime soon. So we're going to have these situations where we use something for a little while and then we let it go. And I think that's a healthy ecosystem. I think that is a way for us to make a better ecosystem for everyone. We have a lot of JavaScript developers out there. It's one of the most popular languages ever, and I think is the most popular language if you combine it with TypeScript. And because of that, obviously, we have a lot of opinionated people that build opinionated tools, and we just have a lot of choice. So on the one hand, yes, sometimes it's confusing. On the other hand, we have a ton of choice and we can do whatever the heck we want. And, you have a choice to use these things or not use these things. You can always use vanilla JavaScript if you want.
I wanted to say something actually really quick, and this is going to sound like it's not related, but it is. And a prime example of this being like that, these tools may not be in the zeitgeist, but some people use them, some people love them, some people will continue to use them even on and spin them up on new projects that will be in the future. I think it's just and kind of like an attestament, I guess. I don't know if that's the right word, but an attestment to there being a lot of different projects out there. Like this is the part that's going to sound unrelated, but I was rooting around for the game Stalker. I was rooting around the subreddit for some help in the game because I was getting my ass kicked. And somebody just randomly mentioned that there was a mobile game. And I thought, this is kind of weird. And just like a few days before, I think it might have been a few weeks before, somebody had taken the mobile game. And I don't mean a mobile game like for Android or whatever. I'm talking like an old mobile game that I want to say was for Java phones. Don't quote me on that. I just kind of quickly went through this post. But this is an old game. And somebody ported it and it runs on PC. And I was like, what? Like who spent, who did this? And then I went to not a repo, but there's sort of a page for it. And just the day before, there had been something added that said something to the tune of like a map editor change or map editor. And I was thinking to myself, like, we're worried about what's in the zeitgeist, probably like, I don't know, 90% of the time, 80% of the time, something like that. Now, maybe that's a bit of the content creator in us. But someone made a totally legit project taking an old mobile game and making it accessible for, the masses to give it a try because they like the series. I would imagine they like the series. I would hope they like the series. So it's just kind of crazy to me that, like Stalker in and of itself is sort of a more niche game series. It's pretty big, but it is still more niche than say like a Fallout. However, somebody loved the mobile game enough to do the porting on it and to put the work in. And when you work with old technology like that, this is how it loops back in. When you work with old technology like that, you're likely going to have to do some hacky stuff or stuff that brings in tools that aren't necessarily in the zeitgeist. You're going to have to bring in, converters and all other matter of plugins and tools to make that thing work. And that's like a totally legit project, right? And so you don't have to be in the zeitgeist to be making a legit project. And I feel like some people need to hear that. A lot of people will really gravitate toward the most popular, the most interesting, the most talked about. But you do not need to be doing that. If you believe in the project and whatever it is, there's so many types of projects out there. We could probably have episodes on types of projects, for the next rest of our lives, realistically speaking.
Yes, exactly. And it's really important to understand the difference of zeitgeist popular and actually popular. Like you can look at, and stuff comes back from the zeitgeist too. Like we talking PHP was not popular. Like no one was talking about it 2 years ago. Like it was assumed dead in the zeitgeist. It was still extremely used, very highly used. Even 2 years ago when no one was talking about it, it's back. It's in the zeitgeist now. People are like raving about Laravel. People are raving about PHP. Like it is fully back. So stuff can come back. New updates can bring it back, stuff like that. So there's nothing wrong with continuing to use something that does the job. Always a good option, especially if you're just there to, you're a contractor, you're just trying to do the job. It's important. But to be in the zeitgeist also means that you're kind of just trying to stay relevant in today's job market. And that's really the most important part of the zeitgeist is like, if you look at Indeed and all the jobs that are available, that's the important zeitgeist, not Twitter. Twitter is like, whatever. It's, if you want to be a content creator, then that is it. But the important one is the one that's going to get you a job. That's the real zeitgeist you want to pay attention to. And that changes throughout the years. So like jQuery has slowly been removed as like a necessary requirement on a lot of different people's Indeed portfolios or Indeed job postings. And like React has started to, appear more and more. Not to say that there's no jQuery. Obviously, people still require it, but there's less and less and less. And that should lead you to believe that, hey, this one is not as needed today to get a job as React, for instance. And that can change in the next 5 years. That might change to something else. So just be aware of that if you're looking for a job. If you're just interested in web development tech, then just get really into the zeitgeist stuff like we do and, follow newest trends, try the newest tech. And it's fun. Like, I'm not going to say it's not fun. I like looking at the newest stuff. And that's why I do it. I don't do it just for like shits and just because. I do it because I legitimately enjoy being at the cutting edge.
I do have a question there, actually. Like, and this might be a question for another episode, but we have talked about job posting boards. Like we say Indeed, but in fact, we're talking just kind of job boards in general. And a lot of the time, like we'll say, like a lot of the jobs that are posted, on these job posting networks are kind of like questionable, or some of them are even going to be scams if it gets through like the protections that the various platforms offer, things like that. So I guess my question there is like, how much should people really be relying on that? That might be too loaded of a question for this sort of episode's focus, but it's just sort of a question where, like, I know that we've talked about in the past, resume, or kind of like, portfolio. Like there was an episode that we did where we talked about like portfolio and like finding out what skills are needed and this and that. And I guess like some people might be turned off by job posting boards because like a lot of people say you're gonna find it difficult to get a job from a job board. You're going to find it difficult to find like a good paying job, or one that isn't a scam, or this and that and this and that. And there's like lots of that sort of like talk out there. And so I guess people would then naturally become skeptical to what skills are even being listed. I don't know how you would even filter that out. Again, it might be too loaded of a question right now, but.
Yeah, I mean, just because it's harder to get a job through a job board nowadays doesn't mean that people aren't going to get jobs through a job board. Like, it's still, if I was in the job seeking phase, right, I would be using a job board. I would be using networking. I would be doing multiple different things. Job board would just be one aspect of that. And, you could get some leads through jobs board. It's still possible. It's just, yes, it is harder. And there are some scammy job posts that are always around just to like keep their names in the zeitgeist, like the company's names in the zeitgeist and stuff like that when they do need to hire, or to collect resumes and then reach out when they do need to hire, whatever. There is that going on. So not everything is there just, for people hiring right away. But the point is, you apply to a lot of jobs through a job search or a job post, a job board. Sorry, my brain is not working. And then the rest of the time you go through and try to network, try to specialize, try to open source, like talk to open source developers, like that. You do the things outside of the job board more often now than you would before, because you're not always going to have success there if you just stick to one thing. But yeah, like there's no real way to filter, if that's what you're saying. Like there's no real way to find the right jobs in the job post, in the job board, that are going to be fruitful. The ones that are up all the time are sometimes hiring, sometimes not.
Yeah, I was more so concerned of like, if people get a bad taste in the mouth from using these job boards,
They will.
and that what they will,
Yeah.
sure. Well, I mean, any experience that it doesn't work out,
Yes.
naturally, like, even if the job posting is like completely legit, if it's like an 8-step thing that you have to do online for hours, like, of course that's going to leave a bad taste in your mouth. And like, that's not up to the job board most of the time. It's up to the company that, chose to do that procedure. But I guess my thing is like, if they have a bad taste in their mouth, like, would they get a bad taste in their mouth about like, hey, these people are asking for JavaScript, and I don't know if I could trust that. You know what I'm trying to say? Like, I don't know if I could trust that to like guide me to what is the most used tools. That's more so what I mean. Like, just because it seems like an area where people are struggling now, some people are definitely going to become skeptics.
Sure, I would still trust it from an overall perspective. Like if there's an analytics on like most of the jobs are asking for this, then I would still trust it from that perspective. Singular jobs, maybe not as much so, but yeah, if an overall stat definitely does drive the direction of where everything is going. Having said that, let's dive right into the first piece of tech that I personally loved that I don't use anymore, which is the Vue 2 options API. So classic Vue had this different way of creating reactive components, and it was through something called the options API. It was a more model view controller pattern, which is something where you have like a model of view and a controller. Like it was a more like classic programming abstraction and architecture versus something like React at the time, which was just getting into hooks, I think. So essentially writing everything in one big file or one big script tag and being able to pull stuff back and forth. Now that's the direction that everything has went, to be clear, including Vue. All the other frameworks have went the direction of kind of the hooks method. So there is a lot of validity to why they went that way. But there was something really cool about having a separation of concerns when you were writing different components and doing reactive software development for web development. Essentially, how this worked was you would have an area called data, where this is the area that you declare variables, right? This is the boilerplate code where you put your variables in there. You don't put them anywhere else, like when you're declaring them. You declare them in here, and then when you declare them in there, that means that they are reactive in your template and they're reactive in your functions and stuff like that. So it made it very easy to understand, like, okay, what variables are actually going to be reactive? Like, what variables are actually going to be used in my templating? So that was one little section. Then there was a section called methods. And that's where you declare your functions, where you could, do some sort of calculation, where you could change a variable, where you could get some data, like if they're an API, like your functions are there. And that's where all your functions would be, in the methods section, right? And then you would have like a computed section, right? And this is where if you're looking for a function that is trying to detect changes to like a variable, so someone presses a button and you want to see that button like multiply a variable by 2 every time, a computed function would automatically detect that change and automatically update that variable for you. So there was this separation of concerns that made it very clear how your code was going to operate. And coming from from someone that never worked with these more robust frameworks before, this was a really easy way for me to understand how reactive development in JavaScript was working, right? Like, it made it very easy for me to like be like, okay, I can put some functions in the methods area, I can put some variables here, and then it should all work together. Like, everything else is just templating. It's like, HTML, CSS, that all makes sense already to me. I don't know. For me, this was the way I learned JavaScript frameworks. This was my first foray into JavaScript frameworks, and I use it quite extensively. I used it in production for a bit. I migrated a jQuery project fully over to it. I really liked it. It made a lot of sense. It clicked with me at the time. I tried React before that as my first one, and I had troubles understanding it. Now, this was back in the class-based React, not the hooks React. So maybe I would have had different opinions then, but the class-based React structure just didn't click with me for whatever reason. I don't know why, but Vue with the options API, the Vue 2 version, it just made sense. Like, I just really liked it, and I evangelized it. Like, I made a bunch of tutorials for it and stuff like that. And yeah, I never really I was never really like thinking of moving away until they started introducing the composition API, which is where they took like inspiration from React hooks. And they're like, well, instead of having these separated data methods computed, here's just your, setup function, and you could do everything in there. So you could pull in your method for like setting a variable. You could just create a function and it'll automatically be there for you. You can use your computed hook and it'll compute. So you could organize your code however you want. You're not forced to put it into these buckets anymore. And that did bring a lot of flexibility and a lot of ways to like do certain things that you couldn't do with the composition API or the options API, but it also lost that like really simple, again, separation of concerns methodology that made it easy for me to understand at least. So I appreciate that I came at the exact right time to understand JavaScript frameworks and then migrate that knowledge over to a more robust method. But I feel bad for people that are starting right now and have to kind of like sift through this, like sometimes organized, but a lot of times really unorganized kind of jumble of code that is much more difficult to understand and wrap your head around unless it's written properly. Like, if someone is a really good developer, you can tell, and it's, you can see how the code is structured. But what the composition API, like the setup function, does is that it allows for a not very senior developer or not very good developer to be able to put code wherever the heck they want and make very complicated spaghetti code much easier than if they were forced to put things in different buckets.
Do you remember when I was experimenting with Vue? Because I remember you brought me in to help with some stuff, and I vaguely remember, well, I guess this is the only thing I remember, is there'd be like the individual files, and the individual files were like different things. So I'd have like HTML, CSS, and JavaScript all in one file. And then there was different areas. So it'd be like, this is the blog post, and this is like the content box. And I would do all the code in there. And then, this is like the home page, and it would be like, there's something else. was that Vue 2 or Vue 3? Like when did you like ask me for help on some of that?
So for you, it was definitely Vue 2 when you were helping. Definitely the options API, the one that we're talking about right now. But overall for you, it was mostly like, hey, can you help me with this layout over here? So like, yeah, you were saying like that was your first experience with components, I think, where like
That's right.
this little thing can be imported into this thing and it can be imported into this thing. So you were working a lot with like the HTML and CSS portion of the file, and then the JavaScript portion I was kind of helping out with at the top. That's the stuff that changed for the most part between Vue 2 and Vue 3. The HTML stuff mostly stayed the same between the two versions, and the CSS stuff, like they're all kind of similar, but it's just the JavaScript that changed, the script tag.
Okay.
Mhm.
So because that was the first version of the HTML All the Things website, wasn't it?
Yes, that's correct.
So that would be Vue 2.
That would be Vue 2, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, so where's it stand today? Where's the composition API stand today? Well, it's pretty much deprecated. Vue 3 still supports it, but any newer version of Vue will say that will not support it anymore. So, some Vue developers that are fine with what Vue 2 or Vue 3 offer can still use it no problem, and there's nothing wrong with that. There are some performance advantages to the composition API, which is the newer one. There are some other advantages that you like. There's certain things you can't do in the options API, which is the old one, versus like that you can do with composition. So there are some trade-offs that you have to give. But if you prefer that kind of mentality of separation of concerns, it's still an option even today. You just know that moving down the line, it might be deprecated and you'll be stuck at whatever version Vue is when it is deprecated fully or removed fully. All right, so next one to talk about here is jQuery. This is a big one, the OG front-end ping. So jQuery was probably my first foray into like framework light, I want to say, like a JavaScript framework light that allowed you to manipulate the DOM pretty easily. Did a bunch of like ways of fetching data a little bit simpler with Ajax. Had some animations built in. I actually use the animations quite a bit, I remember. But it had a bunch of essentially JavaScript utilities made for you that would make it a lot easier for you to develop more complex UI-heavy JavaScript applications. It was again, a framework light library. And it also had a bunch of plugins that people created for jQuery that extended its functionality. And it added cross-browser support where like certain browsers weren't able to do certain functions in JavaScript. What you could do with jQuery is you could just use jQuery and it would detect what browser is being used and then serve whatever function works for that browser. So you didn't have to worry too much about cross-browser support because jQuery handled that for you and abstracted that layer, which was a huge help at the time. I think we used it pretty heavily, Matt. I'm sure that you used it quite heavily in terms of like just extending JavaScript. Like at the time, JavaScript was pretty limited. Like it didn't have a lot of UI, like you could still do a lot of the UI stuff, but it was kind of a hassle to do it with JavaScript. With JavaScript, there was no like get query selector, I think. jQuery made it really easy to get selectors with like the $sign and just like putting, whatever selector, whether it's a dot or a hashtag, it'll automatically determine if that's a ID or a class kind of thing. Like it just made writing JavaScript a lot less robust, a lot less verbose and a lot clearer to understand. JavaScript at the time was like a little bit janky-ish, I want to say. It was very verbose, especially data fetching with the XML HTTP request was a big pain in the ass. Ajax definitely solved that to a certain degree, and so many other things. Again, animations is something that I totally forgot about that I just remember now that jQuery actually did really well. It was a little bit performance intensive, so like if you had a crappier computer, the jQuery animation sometimes would lag, or most of the time would lag, but yeah, it gave you a lot of different options.
Well, I think the thing with this is, I mean, it was kind of weird. Even at the time, we were trying to learn, or I was individually at least trying to learn JavaScript specifically. And it was a real struggle to find tutorials that were JavaScript.
Mhm.
A lot of the time back in the day, of course, you'd Google something and then you would just end up on Stack Overflow. And like now I use AI for a lot of my questions, to be honest, and like random guides on random websites. I haven't really been to Stack Overflow much in years at this point, and probably like a year and a half, maybe 2 years. But back then it was kind of like the place to be. and a lot of the tutorials would just say like, hey, like just use jQuery, or the answer wouldn't even say jQuery. It would just be like, this is the code you need. And I would go to try to use it and be, again, trying to use vanilla JavaScript, and it would not work because it needs jQuery, of course. So I got a pretty good mix. Like in my head, I want to say I use vanilla more than I use jQuery, but it's probably just because I struggled with JavaScript more. And like with jQuery, I just sort of like actually did stuff quicker because it was, again, like a lot less verbose. Like using Ajax to get data and things to update on a page without reloading was such a pain in the ass with the XML HTTP request. It was just like super verbose and not very intuitive. It didn't really make much sense. And the thing that sucked was we weren't using it a lot. So back in the day, I mean, if somebody needed an editor, we would more or less give them WordPress. Many of our clients didn't need editors, so we would just use everything vanilla. And a lot of these sites were very simple, like landing pages or maybe 3-4 page websites. And maybe we would install like Owl Carousel, right? So that was about it. And I think maybe Owl Carousel might use jQuery. But point of the matter is, don't quote me on that either, so I can't remember. But point of the matter is like jQuery was like such a thing that was like always there. If you wanted to use vanilla and you looked anything up, jQuery was always like a solution somewhere where someone's like, just use this and just install jQuery really quick. Like, why don't you have it? Like it was so common that it was assumed installed by so many people. And that has sort of, seemingly faded away. But it was great to, to have, because things like the, the Ajax method, I think it was, or Ajax function, whatever it was just like way easier with jQuery. It made selectors, like actually selecting things, like much more, I think, intuitive. It made it like things a lot better. Now we can just use like, queries and query select all and all that crap that we use in regular JavaScript now, vanilla JavaScript now. But that wasn't the case back in the day. And in some of the selectors we would have would be like, select this class name with this ID specifically with. And it's like, you're 100 characters in or something just on the selector, and you haven't even done anything with it. You haven't set it to anything. And so I found jQuery to be a lot better to do that type of stuff, to be honest. One thing that I always kind of cringed at, one thing I didn't really like about jQuery was that back in the day, again, a lot of our stuff was vanilla. And so our actual websites were very, very small. Like if you want to call it a package size or bundle size, whatever, like the directory in which the website lived was very small. The biggest things in there would be images, if there were images at all. And a lot of the thing was jQuery would come in and just like blow that out of the water. Now, I'm not saying it added a terabyte. I'm not saying it added 2 gigabytes or a gigabyte or anything like that. But it just kind of sucks going from, something that's, tiny, and then it just sometimes can be like, oh, we'll just double the size of our package by adding jQuery. Huge problem? No. Nitpick? Yes, but still something that we did strive for back in the day, especially when we had a website or two that needed to work on dial-up connections or remote internet connections, before the days of Starlink or rural internet being kind of upgraded to, at the very least, cable kind of internet. So, and I mean, that's still a struggle in some parts of Canada today, and I'm sure other places too, but it's just, having somebody that has dial-up download, 300 kilobytes, an extra 100 kilobytes, an extra 200 kilobytes here, there, and everywhere is a lot for them. Text is like kind of the king. And so that was like one thing that we personally kind of ran into. And in terms of jQuery these days, I mean, I will use it if it's in a legacy code base. We do have some older websites running. They're usually, quite simple websites that people will just, quite literally be like every 5 years, be like, man, I need to just upgrade my price. I need to update my price. And it's just listed in plain text. And maybe maybe they're using an editor or something like that. And as a result, it gets updated via jQuery. And so I need to go in and like mess around with the jQuery a bit to change what it looks like and update that price, or, add a new content box if they are having a sale or something like that. And just, again, like really simple websites that are definitely the legacy that are still kicking around in our sort of like client hosting base, I guess you could say. But now that's pretty much my experience with jQuery, like kind of like something that I didn't use primarily, but was always there. And I did use a fair bit, of course. But for whatever reason, I always kind of wanted to use that vanilla JavaScript, more so to get experience with it. And I think I'm better for that, just personally, because now it's like I can just quickly spin something up in vanilla JS and expand a lot of apps. Like if I'm using something like a Webflow or something like that, I don't have to be like, man, is jQuery present? I don't have that question anymore. I can just sort of spin it up. And obviously that did require my skills to be updated as I went along by learning, ES6 and ES6 Plus and all the rest of it. So
Absolutely. And jQuery still has some elegant syntax. Like I'm just looking at the site right now just to remind myself, but the way you can add event listeners, so event handling with just like a dot on and then just put in whatever event listener you want, click whatever. And then the way you can actually like change the HTML or change the content on a page with just the .html and then put whatever text or variables you want inside of that kind of function. Like it is still fairly simple to use. And for small projects, I can still see it being somewhat relevant and somewhat handy, like over just plain JavaScript. But having said that, with the advances that JavaScript has been getting, like, writing .inner HTML versus .html is not that big of a difference. And then not using the $ syntax and writing, document or get by query selector. JavaScript has caught up in a lot of ways to what jQuery offered. It's become less verbose. It's become more functional. It's become better cross-platform. So you don't have to worry about the stuff that jQuery solved for you as much. But as a legacy developer, as someone that's like grown up with jQuery, it still has that nostalgia factor for me. Like just looking at that $ and seeing how querying an element was super simple and how easy it was to do a data request with Ajax and have a success event and an error event all in the same function. Back in that was a huge difference to us. Like that was an absolutely huge difference, and it made our development so much easier. Now, where is it at today? Like, why is it declining, I should say? Well, again, modern JavaScript features have cut up, and the main thing, the most important reason it's declining is frameworks like React and Svelte and Vue. They've come in and made interactive development more robust, a little bit more scaffolded, a little bit more opinionated, and they've made it easier to build more reactive websites and more robust websites than what jQuery offered from the top. So if you have React, right, which is one of the most popular frameworks or libraries for web development right now, you don't need jQuery. And that's why it became less and less popular. Now, I have seen people try to import jQuery into React because, again, familiarity, and people get like confused about what jQuery can do and what React can do. But the reality is that whatever React can do, it can do whatever jQuery can do and more. And that's why it's not relevant to kind of import both of them. And then the other thing is that as soon as you start manipulating many, many different elements, jQuery just wasn't as performant as some of these other frameworks. So on large scale applications, jQuery added a big bundle size and added performance overhead. It just wasn't good at traversing the DOM tree as well as a shadow DOM can do it, or a Svelte compiler can do it and stuff like that. So there was some trade-offs that you had to give while using jQuery.
My storage size stuff is like so skewed too, because I don't remember it being this small, but according to, this is right on the homepage, jQuery.com, lightweight footprint, it says only 30 kilobytes minified and gzipped. Now, maybe I wasn't using minification or something back then. Who knows what I was doing? I know that like I could get the bundle to be pretty small.
Yeah.
But like, I guess at the end of the day, if I'm just using HTML and CSS and JavaScript back in the day on simple websites, like those pages very well could have been like, 5 to 10 kilobytes. And then adding even this, say, very small 30 kilobyte file would be like, whoa, I'm doubling the size of my website. This is crazy. I would also like to say one other thing as well is, we're talking about this thing is kind of being a tool of the past kind of ish. There's a banner up here, jQuery.com. jQuery 4.0 is coming soon. Prepare by upgrading to the latest jQuery 3.x release. Learn more about our version support right up top there. And it's currently at version 3.7.1. So,
Still being developed.
It's going. Like it's still going.
Well, like you said, a lot of very large platforms depend on it, one of them being WordPress. So you can't really abandon it, right? Like it is still like a specific, I don't think WordPress core depends on it. I could be wrong, but WordPress plugins do for sure. A lot of like big WordPress plugins depend on it. So it's still being used very, very heavily in the industry. And the other part of like, it is being upgraded to 4.0, but a lot of that upgrade is like removing a bunch of jQuery code from my understanding and like relying more on more native JavaScript. So it's going to make like performance better and the bundle size smaller, et cetera, et cetera. It's not really adding features to jQuery. It's just making it more modern. So it's not like, yeah, they're not making it better. They're just making it faster and cleaner.
Well, one thing too I want to say is that I'm glad we mentioned the zeitgeist specifically, because I'm just looking at a small snippet from a WP Engine article here in one of their resources. And this is just a random sentence, but it's the jQuery library itself comes bundled with your WordPress installation.
Okay.
And then there's another, this is just from a support forum. So, it's not written in stone, but they say you can absolutely build a website in WordPress with a jQuery on the front end, but many themes and plugins still use it extensively. So when we say that, I mean, if WordPress is, 40-ish, whatever % of the websites out there, I mean, so that means jQuery is involved with a significant portion of those, because I know some people will try to delete it and, whatever. WordPress is so customizable that it's not guaranteed that anything included with the installation is going to be there. However, that's crazy to think. So it's sort of like we're talking about jQuery as if it's this like old legacy thing, but it's like, yeah, but it's also on 40% of websites.
Absolutely.
Could you imagine having a project that was that successful at that reach? That's crazy.
Yep.
Like you'd be making money hand over fist, and people would be like, that's legacy. It's like, cool, I'll just take my legacy dollars and keep scooping it up.
Yeah. I mean, it depends on, like, I don't know if it makes any money because it's completely open source and free. So
yeah, I guess I'm thinking more like, you can monetize via selling a product. Obviously jQuery is not that, but selling a product or having exposure or like whatever, like there's a value that you could equate to dollars to having such a huge install base. Whether, you have to you'd have to put on your like entrepreneurial hat a little bit there, but still, that's crazy.
Absolutely. So jQuery, really cool. Where it stands today is WordPress plugins, big one, lurking in a lot of legacy code bases, like Matt's saying, and occasionally still useful for some quick prototyping, honestly, in my opinion, if you're used to it. Nothing wrong with just spinning it up a little bit and getting something going. Not a big, like, it's still a relevant framework, in my opinion. But yeah, that's it for jQuery. We'll move on to the next one, Moment.js. So this one out of all of them is probably, let me just take a look. Yeah, this one out of all of them is probably the most like not used today or done one, still in legacy frameworks, or in legacy code bases. But let me explain. So Moment was the all-in-one king of dates library for JavaScript. JavaScript date manipulation or like how it handles dates is kind of a disaster. The way it handles local time zones versus like UTC time zones, like the weirdness and how you parse like a standard date format into another date format, all of that is kind of a disaster of JavaScript. Like as soon as you've worked on a fairly complex calendar component for an app, you'll understand. But what Moment did was it created a lot of functions for you, like a ton of functions for you to handle like an easy parsing of dates, changing dates, like, setting a date and then adding a bunch of days to it, and it automatically knowing what month it's in and what days, like manipulating time functions. Like it just had a ton of functionality for manipulating date and time. And it was the de facto, again, plugin, the de facto library for handling dates. No one was doing it manually. Everyone was using Moment.js for like at least 5 years, I want to say 5-6 years. Then sometime around 2020, I think it announced that it's going into like deprecated mode. And what that meant is like they officially marked it as like, hey, we've solved everything. We're done. We're no longer maintaining this project. At around that time, at the same exact time, new libraries started to appear a little bit before they announced this. One called DateFNS, the other one called Luxin. There was more that were handling pretty much everything that Moment was handling, but in a much more modular and performant way. One big negative of Moment, similar to jQuery back in the day, was the fact that it did introduce a pretty significantly large package size. When you would only even use like one feature, there was no tree shaking available at the time of like, only taking this one function. It would do the whole package, which was fairly large at the time. And you would just use that one function in it and never use it again, but it would still have to load on every page load. What other libraries started to do was do more modular, importing, more modern importing, the ability to tree shake functions. So instead of importing, 100 kilobits, you were importing 2 kilobits or 3 kilobits. So it was a pretty significant change. And Moment just didn't want to go down that route anymore, as far as I understand it. So like, we're done. Like there's good alternatives out there. I think on their website, they even pointed to DateFNS when they did the official blog post, being like, hey, if you want a more maintained library, go here. And that was it. So it was one of those things where like, yeah, overnight, it became pretty irrelevant. So like, would you recommend Moment.js today to anyone for any reason? And the answer is usually no. Like there is no reason to ever use Moment.js because it's never going to be updated, has a heavier library size, and there's better alternatives out there that are much more performant and are more maintained. Now, is it still being used? Hell yeah. Same with how jQuery is. It was in a ton of legacy apps. Like it was the de facto date library for years and years and years. So yeah, for sure. But unless you're maintaining an old project, you're not going to get there. You're not going to use it.
Well, I was going to say that I made a custom countdown clock for a client that runs a sports website. And we did a whole thing where obviously the events were going to be happening in a certain time zone because the events are international. And then we wanted to have it so that it would read the user's clock and the countdown would reflect based upon the user's clock, or at least whatever clock was available to the browser, because I know people configure their PCs all over the place. But basically, it would count down based on that, and then, whatever. But I just used vanilla JavaScript. I ended up, kind of writing that up myself, kind of making a little plugin. However, anytime I went searching, and this was, way past 2020, it was probably like 2023, it was always like MomentJS, just use Moment, just use Moment, just use Moment. I saw that left, right, and center. Some of these other, like, there's some alternatives and things like that, and those are listed on the Moment website, but it was all over the place. And I just kind of want to read a little thing here. So I'm just at the project status document that is provided by MomentJS.com. And it says as of September 2020, Moment gets over 12 million downloads per week. So I just went over to NPM and just looked at the Moment JS downloads, and we were at over 8.2 million weekly downloads. There was even a dip, and then it came back up. Now, maybe that dip was Christmas, but the thing is this thing's used. Mm-hmm. And I mean, it is in maintenance mode. It's a legacy project, but there was a publish to the NPM repo, I suppose, 1 year ago. So, we're in 2025 now. So like, something has happened in between now and then. Now, it even says here, like in the status document, that they do discourage using Moment on newer projects, and then they do have a list of alternatives. So, go check that out, of course, if you want. But it's crazy. It's crazy to hear, there's such a large project that has such an impact on search results, which is kind of a weird angle to take, but such an impact on search results would, kind of be shut down in that way. And I do actually want to kind of highlight one small thing too, is that I don't know if I was using ChatGPT at the time. I may have been using Copilot, or I may not have been using an AI at all. I think it was a Copilot though, because something like one of my research kind of strings when I was researching how to make this plugin really was trying to drive home Moment. And it might have been Copilot, not GitHub Copilot, but Copilot Consumer, I guess you could say. And I mean, that's what's going to happen with a lot of these AI tools, is that like a huge project that has so much influence on the market is going to take so long to fade away, if it fades away at all, that I mean, AI is going to learn about time zones and learn how to do it, and it's going to be like, Moment is huge, let's use that. Like, it's possible that that's exactly what would happen with a lot of this stuff, and I wouldn't be surprised if that's why I kept finding it so much in my research. And so this is yet another kind of small annoying thing that newbies have to deal with, because I mean, like Mike and I, we just set up, like I've been messing around with just trying to make a blog just for fun with like Svelkhead and Strappy, just to kind of play with it. And I've been messing around with it, and I had some Git problems actually, specifically. And I mean, Mike even told me, he's like, I was using ChatGPT just to get me started because I wanted to make like a boilerplate repo so I could fall back, because I'm sure I'll bugger it up a bunch of times. And Mike even said, like, he's like, even though you told it, hey, I want to do this thing easily, ChatGPT led you down the wrong route. And I wouldn't be surprised. I'm not blaming ChatGPT or anything, But there's going to be examples like this, MomentJS and other ones that have like a huge impact where the AI might be like, if it doesn't get enough data to say that Moment is out of date, like it really might, say, hey, yeah, just use Moment real quick. Or if I like ask like a really specific question that Moment has a lot of documentation on for like something really specific, it'll like look at its data in its, database or whatever. It'll like look through its own knowledge base and be like, let's use Moment for that because they got the most information, which is not a dumb decision, but you're kind of quote unquote not supposed to do that. So it's a weird, we're in a weird state with some of this stuff with like AI is learning off these things that are legacy. And it almost feels like maybe we should tell them like, hey, this is like somehow flag it. This is a legacy thing. Learn about it for lore. So I can ask like, yo, what is this? But like, don't really learn about it. However, I'm sure there's someone listening to this that's like, I use Moment all the time. I want my ChatGPT to still help me with Moment. So I don't know how you solve that. I'm not an AI developer, but just an interesting, I guess, Moment related, AI related sort of observation that I've had.
I don't want to go too far on the, tech bias of these LLMs tangent, but I think there are ways to solve this. I think that a proprietary way that a maintainer of a library can communicate with these LLMs in a official sense of like, if you're a maintainer, you're able to edit something in the core database, maybe a .llm file in GitHub of these public things that the LLMs will read and take seriously. Whether that .llm file will tell you it's deprecated or not, or whether it will give you more context about that technology, because one of the bigger issues with LLM kind of tech bias is the fact that newer tech has a much harder time being recommended because there's just not as much examples. There's not as much, code out there to get it to recommend. So what you can do is you could feed those examples into a, LLM file and hope, and when an LLM is being trained, it scrapes that repository, it can take that as like a more advanced way of like learning about that piece of tech, that library, whatever, that framework, and prioritize that based on those LLM files. So it kind of forces developers to feed it better information. And then there's competitions between who can make the best LLM file. I think there are ways to handle this, is all I'm trying to say. And I really hope that these kind of larger language model people like OpenAI, DeepSeek, the Claude, Gemini, all of these people get together and come up with the standard on how to handle this. Otherwise, first of all, Next.js is always going to rule. Moment will never go away. Like there's just going to be these serious, significant issues moving down the line that we don't want. We want innovation to continue. And that is at a very real point in history where it could go away. Like people can stop developing libraries because as soon as, AI development takes off more than it is right now, they'll notice that their libraries aren't being used because AIs are just not recommending them. But yeah.
It'll be like an SEO fight,
kind
almost
of,
in a way. Like it's like I actually do call it AI SEO to my clients. Usually it's just me yelling at them to try to get them to use the proper headings because they just use like, I'll use an H6 at the top. Yeah, please don't do that. Please don't do that. Just use a smaller font size. Like, what are you doing? But I mean, the AI SEO is, again, what I'm going to call it, is a real thing. Like I've gotten people to have like their products. Like we have a couple clients that are, their products are stat based, meaning it's really is like a value per kilogram type of thing. Like it's a bulk sold product. You need to know that stuff. It'll tell you the types of packaging you're getting. Because if you're buying it in bulk, like, am I getting a truckload? Am I getting a bag? Is it a box? Like, what is it? Because it's important for warehouses and I mean, storing it in your house if you're buying it from a consumer perspective, things like that. And like having an AI analyze a page that is a mess in terms of its own organization with the headings and stuff. I mean, the AI can mostly figure it out, but why wouldn't you give it a helping hand to ensure that it figures it out? Because we have a client right now that is so in to AI that he just uses it 24/7. He's always on it. He's like using Google and stuff less and things like that. He's always on it. Their customers, so the people that are selling this bulk product, their customers could be the same way. And you need to be like, hey, this is a thing that people are going to start using, meaning ChatGPT. Your client might go to the webpage that you have for this bulk product. They copy the link in and say, hey man, like I got this much space in my warehouse, is this all right? You want that AI to give you the most perfect amount of data. You want to help that AI get it so that that person's not accidentally ordering 100 bags when they went to order 100 boxes. Like that's really, really critical. And yes, it is the customer's fault that they ordered the wrong thing. Totally get that. I'm not talking in terms of legality and all that, whatever. I'm talking in terms of you don't want that angry phone call. Like you just want to avoid that as much as you can. Avoid any sort of problem as much as you can.
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay. Moving on from LLM stuff into Cordova. So this one I used a ton of. And honestly, at the time, at least, I think we even started it when it was called PhoneGap, or it was during the transition between PhoneGap to Cordova, right? Like, yeah, it was a confusing time again. Anytime you use any web technology is always a confusing time, but that was especially confusing because when you're Googling problems, because it was the transitionary period, it was either Cordova or PhoneGap. So like it was tough to Google, kind of a pain in the ass. But essentially what Cordova was a builder, like a builder that would take your JavaScript, HTML, and CSS code and make it into a iOS or Android application. I think it would also do some like desktop applications as well, Mac OS and Windows, like EXEs, I think. I could be wrong there.
Not 100. That sounds familiar,
Maybe.
But I just don't remember.
Maybe it wasn't fully supported. I don't know. What we used it for was Android and iOS, to be clear, because we were creating a web application that we ported to Android devices, and they would run kind of like this not photo booth, but kiosk software continuously on them. So it allowed you to, access device APIs. It had ways to do a bunch of really cool, like native things in your web applications. And it was all like kind of like a command line way to build a full-on APK or a app, whatever it was for the iOS side. I can't remember. At the time, this was before React Native. Before React Native for sure, I want to say. This was probably like there was a couple other, I think, options, but I think this was the like more popular zeitgeist option, and it worked really well. Like we tried it, we never had experience with it before, and it just built an application for us that opened really easily in like Android Studio, or like specifically for us, Android Studio connected to a device, open on that device. Now, configuration was difficult sometimes, like setting it up, especially if you wanted to put it on an app store or something like that. There was a pretty steep learning curve on that stuff. It wasn't super easy. It wasn't as easy as deploying a regular web application at the time, but it was an option for a web developer to be able to build a native-like-ish experience, quote unquote. But why it declined, I think, is pretty obvious because it's still around. That's another thing I want to say. Like people still use it. It's still being maintained as far as I checked last time I checked. But newer technology became more prevalent. So stuff like PWAs became more popular, which did something similar. It allowed you to install a web application on a device without having to go through app stores, right? So it kind of took away a little bit of the heat that you needed to do for like actually creating an APK. And it allowed you to do some native API stuff too. Like PWAs were really cool and are cool, just not used very much anymore. Or as far as I understand it, maybe they are. React Native came into the picture. React Native was a kind of better solution to this because it didn't rely on web views. Cordova essentially created a web view for your application, whereas React Native actually used the native UI system of whatever cross-platform app it's building. It did still have a translation layer on it, I want to say. It's not like a perfectly created iOS app or Android app, but React Native was a better step. That was a step in the direction of better performance, better integration, and easier to maintain usually, because if you have a React code base for your web, you could just add a React Native code base, reuse the same functionality, and kind of split between that. So it was a more robust version of Cordova. A little bit actually more complicated to create because, again, you were relying on native React Native Vue components. You can't use like HTML inside of React Native. You use specific React Native components, which translate into specific like iOS or Android components, like Vue components. But again, that allowed it to be more native-like. And yeah, I think web views were very finicky. We've mentioned this on the show many times before. The biggest issues that we had was like every version of Android came with a different version of web views, which had different supported features. So when you're developing for a device for developing an app for multiple different devices or infinite different devices. It was really difficult to make sure that it was cross compatible because people can't like update their web views, or they couldn't at the time. It had to be an Android OS update to update the web view, or people could switch to a different browser by default and then it might update the web view or something like that. But we couldn't rely on that. Like, you had to develop for the lowest common denominator, which is the person that's using the device as it stands. So that was a huge pain in the ass, relying on web views and the limited functionality of web views. Like, they're limited to the JavaScript engine, obviously. Like, you only can use so many gigs of RAM. It can only do synchronous development. Like, I think web workers weren't really a thing at the time, so you couldn't even do any parallel programming, et cetera, et cetera. Like, there were significant issues, but for really simple web apps or like no native applications, it did really well. And we did some crazy stuff with it for actually displaying consistent media and being able to still go through and, you know, constantly display media for 24 hours a day. That was a really big challenge that probably could have been a little bit easier with a more native platform, but it was a really good way for me to learn performance in JavaScript. That's for sure.
Man, I loved Apache Cordova. I got really good at it, actually. I made it so that the web views ran really well. I was using a web view. So I was making Android apps, and I made it for the Berryflow website back in the day, which was a BlackBerry sort of like fan site outlet, news, all that kind of stuff, reviews. And I mean, at the time I was using a Z10, and it like obviously needed like a BlackBerry like app. I couldn't get the BlackBerry app working. Like, I tried to get the BlackBerry app working through Apache Cordova because I believe you could package it through that. I couldn't get that working because it needed some special stuff and I was pretty new. But I like dumped all my kind of time and learning and stuff into Android, and I got Android running so good, and Android apps did work on BlackBerry 10. So I used to use my own app. I made a whole podcast app on there. You could stream the actual audio. You could listen to it, go to the site and everything. And like, I built it, and the person I built it for even said, like, I was unaware that this was a web view until you told me. It's like, I got really good at like masking the fact that you were using a web view. And it was my first app. It was on the App Store for a long time. It's gone now because the website is gone as well. However, like, I just got really, really good at it. I had a lot of fun with it. The actual Apache Cordova was very, very, I found, intuitive, easy to use, easy to like mess around with, figure out. I think I spent maybe, I want to say 3 weeks total, 1 week, like a lot. So like kind of like 1 week of crunch, I guess, that I put on myself. And then 2 weeks just sort of like tweaking and stuff to finish up the app. And it basically like showed the Berryflow articles. It showed and played the podcasts, and there was something else. I think there was like another part of the site that we separated into different options on the bottom navbar. And it was a lot of fun. I really liked it. I did look up, as Mike was talking, I did look up some lore here. So about Apache Cordova. So Apache Cordova was originally created by Nitobi. Adobe Systems purchased Nitobi in 2011. They rebranded it as PhoneGap, and then they later released an open source version of the software called Apache Cordova. Now here's the crazy thing. So we're talking, 2011, things like that. So there's an article here, Goodbye PhoneGap. This is from the contributors of Apache Cordova on August 14th of 2020, so not that long ago. And it says, Adobe recently announced that PhoneGap is shutting down. And how is Cordova affected? In short, not much. And then there's an article there. I'm going to include links to these in the show notes, just because I'm obviously referring to this. But there's another article here that says, this is from apppresser.com, and it says, PhoneGap build, the cloud service for hybrid Cordova and Ionic apps will be discontinued later this year. And this is, of course, an article from 2020. And there's a lot more details on here as well. So I don't know, I'm glad Apache Cordova is still around. Like, I really enjoy using it. I thought it was really simple. I know Mike kind of mentioned some performance specific sort of concerns, but for effectively taking a website, making it mobile friendly and like make it look like a mobile app is, I would almost say, PhoneGap / Apache Cordova's bread and butter. It's a big thing. Like, back then it was sort of like, do you want to learn all this native Android stuff? And it's like, not really. Like, for us personally in our kind of personal / professional lives, we were still learning web development largely. And I mean, this was a perfect way to handle it. Like, use Apache Cordova, don't have to learn many new skills. The process of getting it from like a dev version to actually applying and putting it on like Google Play was a bit of a pain, like Mike said, but I figured that out in like an hour, and that was it. So I'm a fan of this project. I really enjoyed working with it, and I mean, I would use it again if I needed to do a similar project.
Yep, I'm in the same boat. I think it saved me back then. It would probably still save me now. I might try React Native. I haven't tried it in a long time. The other option is Flutter. I would not do that again, probably. That was kind of a pain in the ass. It's a whole mobile language for building cross-platform applications that is outside of like any other language. It's its own language. Like you're using Dart. I don't know how maintained it is right now. I was kind of a big fan of it at the time, but that might have been the wrong choice. But yeah, I would probably try Cordova again or go to React Native. I love Cordova, honestly. It was a great time. I just haven't had the need to use it. And the last one here is Bootstrap. So this one is kind of JavaScript, kind of not. I think there is some JavaScript to it though, so that's why I wanted to talk about it. And I don't know, like talking about the CSS side of things is fine too, because that, it was something that we used pretty heavily at the time. Essentially, Bootstrap is a front-end framework that had a bunch of pre-built components, stuff like modals, drop-downs, input fields, boxes, nav bars. Like it had a bunch of pre-built opinionated components that you could customize pretty heavily. You just import any component you want, use it, and then just, there's a bunch of props that you could pass in that would change its colors and change everything else. There's a bunch of default templates for Bootstrap that made prototyping and creating an initial website really quick. It was a very, very well maintained, is a very well maintained library, UI component library. And the JavaScript side of things is like it handled a lot of your like accessibility things where, your custom drop-down menus still function like drop-down menus, your custom date pickers still function like date pickers, stuff like that. So it handled a lot of your complex input functionality on the JavaScript side all on its own. And yeah, it made building for us, I should say for me, really easy because I'm not a designer, and it was really opinionated. So it was like, this is, a template for a landing page. You could throw it up there and it looks decent, right? Like, and this is a nav bar. You could throw it up there. It looks decent. This is a box with like the right input fields and the right radiuses and stuff like that. It looks decent. So like, it just made it easier for me to do a quick website or a quick web application without having to worry about the styling too much. Now, you could still do a lot of customization, I should be clear. Like, you could still make it look very different than the default styling, but it took a little bit of work. It wasn't like you're only doing native CSS. You had to do some, prop injection and stuff like that. It wasn't super simple to customize fully, I should say. Like, it was simple to customize certain things, but customize exactly how you wanted it. So that's where maybe it wasn't the most popular, or isn't the most popular framework now. But yeah, I think like why it's in decline, or, quote unquote decline, it's another one of those ones that's being used really heavily still. It relied on jQuery at the time. So as jQuery went down in popularity and performance, it also went down in popularity and performance. Is the same thing. So like it was a pretty heavy framework. Like, you were importing quite a few things. Now, modernization of that, I think, has occurred where they have the ability to tree shake. So you're not importing the entire Bootstrap or anything like that. You're importing only the components you're using. So like I think it's gotten better over the years in that sense. But initially there was a pretty big significant gap between something like Tailwind CSS, which came around, which was very similar to Bootstrap, I want to say, but from a different perspective. So it was less opinionated. It didn't have your components pre-built for you. It had just a way to build components using inline styles, right? And you could use similar, like it had a design system that it came with, like the, different font sizes and different fonts and stuff like that. But it wasn't like, here's your box. Instead, you're building the box with HTML and CSS, but instead of CSS, you're using Tailwind in the inline style. So it was a more customizable, less opinionated approach. And then people built UI libraries on top of it. So that kind of replaced the need for Bootstrap, even for the opinionated people. So you had the benefits of both a opinionated UI library that can be fully customizable, however you want, with any sort of classes you want to add to it without having to import like a third-party NPM package UI element. You're just literally importing HTML, or just like copying and pasting HTML with classes in it. And so that drove its decline in the zeitgeist again. I want to be clear there. People just appreciated the customization that Tailwind offered over Bootstrap, but Bootstrap from my understanding, it's still used pretty damn heavily.
I mean, just going right to the Bootstrap website, which is getbootstrap.com. I mean, you can already see that this thing's really well supported.
Yeah.
Like, we're currently on version 5.3.3. The very first thing actually on the page, right at the top, short of the nav bar, is get security updates for Bootstrap 3 and 4. So seemingly there's great support for older things. And Bootstrap, totally. Like, I would use Bootstrap today. This is another one of these projects that I really enjoyed using for quick putting things together. Like, we had a couple of clients that would come to us and be like, I don't really know what I want to do on my website fully yet, but I, want a quick landing page. Boom, Bootstrap, no brainer, go in there, fire it up. They basically, have their contact us button, meaning our client would have a contact us button, maybe a product name if they had that, or website name if they had that, and that would be it, right? Background image, and that's just about it. Maybe like they would slowly add a nav bar to have like a landing page as the home page, and then a contact us page. Fastest way for me personally to do that is either vanilla. A little bit faster is using Bootstrap, especially with default styles, especially if the project is that early. I used to use Bootstrap all the time for stuff like that. I used to use it for myself as well. So I got into Sass because in order to customize some of the things within Bootstrap, you have to use Sass. And then I got into Sass, and then I used Bootstrap specifically. This is just a personal thing, but I used Bootstrap specifically to learn Sass at the time. So obviously I would use Sass to modify what was, kind of going on under the hood in Bootstrap in terms of colors and things like that. However, I would use just a Bootstrap site to basically spin up a site really quick, and then I would make my own stuff on the web page and make sure I was using Sass to learn it. So not that Bootstrap is attributed with me learning Sass, but it certainly was heavily influenced. It certainly got the ball rolling. And if I needed to spin up a very, very quick website for myself, I would, it'd be one of two: vanilla real quick or Bootstrap real quick, either one. Honestly, really enjoy Bootstrap. Don't really have anything, terrible to say about it. I know that it suffers from the same thing as a lot of other, which is almost like suffers by design. So I don't even know if I want to say the word suffer. Is we've used it on some client sites and people are like, I don't like how this looks. I don't like how that looks. I don't like how this looks. And it's just sometimes when a client is that picky, the amount of customizations you have to do to something, it's sort of like, I'm just going to make this custom because you're asking too much. But that's not really Bootstrap's fault. In fact, it isn't Bootstrap's fault. It is quote unquote the client's fault versus maybe our fault for saying, let's do something kind of more generic, if you will. And the client's like, I don't want that. Fair enough. So that's really the only thing that I have bad to say about Bootstrap. I mean, like I said, I've liked the last two things we've talked about a lot. Like jQuery was just sort of there incidentally. If I want to go back to sort of closer to the beginning of the episode, jQuery was just sort of there, but Apache Cordova, very fond memories of that. And Bootstrap, very fond memories of that too. And again, this is still in my tool set. I just haven't needed to use it in a long time.
Yeah, exactly. Like, I don't know. I probably wouldn't reach for it today because I've gotten really used to the Tailwind and Shad CN approach for all of my projects. So that kind of replaces the need for Bootstrap on all fronts. But I did really enjoy using it at the time, and it did help a ton in prototyping and building out quick UIs. So I appreciate what it did, and I appreciate what it does today. It's just I found a kind of an approach that works better for me. That's all.
Yeah, like I mean, different tools,
Yep.
for different Things. Like, I mean, I've used Tailwind CSS, and just for me personally, like I would, I'm not against Tailwind CSS, but I would totally reach for Bootstrap before. Just if it was quite literally like I'm playing with, like I said, Strappy and Svelte right now. Honestly, like if it was like, hey, like I just want to learn Strappy, for example, like I just want to learn how to mess around with a headless CMS, I would likely spin up the front end. I would even probably skip like Svelte and stuff. I'd just go and grab Bootstrap real quick. If I'm like zooming in on Strappy specifically, and I'm like, I just want to be able to like pull some data that I've written, inside of my headless CMS, I would honestly reach for Bootstrap, because I would just be like, oh, like title, like inside of the CMS. And now let's pull that in. Things like that. I would likely just do that because I like to use things that I'm in areas that I'm not trying to learn. I would prefer to use something I'm very familiar with, and that's very like, kind of set it up and it's there and it's good to go. And so that I'm not thinking about that front end at all. And then in this scenario, I'm like focusing all my detail oriented learning on like, what is Strappy doing? How is it saving things? Why can I not pull this data? What does this mean? Things like that. And I don't want to be like, why is this Svelte kit not working? Because I'm not amazing at Svelte kit. So I don't want a distraction basically. And so that is Bootstrap for me. That's my bootstrap.
That's my bootstrap. Yeah, no, it's fair. I think that's it, though. That's the tech that I love, that I don't use much anymore. There's probably more that I haven't thought of, but I'm curious to know everyone else's. What is something that you loved, that you learned back in the day, or even a few years ago or a couple years ago, that you just aren't reaching for anymore, but still have fond memories of? So you can definitely, post on X at HTML everything there, or Instagram or Threads at HTML the things there. Curious to know what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I'd be interested to know too, because I'm sure there's going to be people out there that like totally love Bootstrap, still, neck high in jQuery. The list goes on. I'm not going to go list off all the technologies. They're counting. They're looking at their MomentJS clock. It's got a reference for each of the text, but jokes aside, no, I'd like to hear from that too, to kind of like get a picture of like what people are using. Were they totally in love with like Owl Carousel and now they don't use it anymore? Things like that. But yeah, no, if you want to, let us know, of course, like Mike said, if you want to support episodes like this, you can do so at Patreon. That is patreon.com/HTML, all the things. And many thanks to our $3 tier patrons: Tim from The Web Hacker on thewebhacker.com, Jason from Geek Life Radio via geekliferadio.com, Garrett Segal, Level Up Financial Planning via www.levelupfinancialplanning.com, Magnus from YesWeb via yesweb.se, Syntaxify from the HTML All the Things Discord server, and Stacy Mosteler from the website swoonworthydesigns.com. And we'd like to give a shout out to Michael LaRocca, a contributing author on HTMLallthethings.com. Michael is the author of Self-Taught, the X Generation blog at selftaughttxg.com. Feel free to leave a comment or a review on the platform that you are listening to this on, and this outro will sign us off.
You've been listening to HTML All the Things podcast. Web development, web design, and small business. We hope you've gotten some useful and practical information from this show. And we hope you appreciate that we talk to you like human beings. And we hope you had some fun. We'll be back soon. But in the meantime, hit us up on social media. On Facebook, Instagram, and Patreon at HTML All the Things. And on Twitter at HTML Everything. Until next time, this is HTML All the Things, signing off.